me through how to do that. That's great.
Okay. So open up your presentation.
Okay.
We're just going to test from the 3 mics that we have set up in this room.
Hi, Victor. Check 1, 2, 1, 2. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
And set your camera as well.
That sounded like Julia Child.
Hello, Laura. I can't hear you. Can't. There. Now I can.
It's working fine now, Laura.
I'm sorry. Yeah, you can let me know when you want to start. We are live streaming right now, but just the placeholder in there. Okay. I'm gonna send a message. Yeah. What was it? Record to the cloud. There we go.
Recording in progress.
Oh, just a second. No, I'm controlling it from here. Give me a moment.
Laura's back. Hello, Laura.
I think you turned it off.
Me? Maybe not. Can you hear me? Is it working, the microphone? Because I can't notice. Okay. To me, it's not very. Okay, now you can. Okay. Because I was like, it sounds odd. It's not. So we are starting in like 4 minutes. We're waiting until 2:35. Yeah, so basically, I mean, my idea is like, Okay.
All right, Swabi, quick test with you.
Okay. So, so I think I might start. They are managing. I can't manage.
Yeah, okay, there we go.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Yes. So I think we can start. So first of all, I want to thank everybody to be here. Good afternoon, and welcome to Queer International History, Migration, and Human Rights. I am Alessio Ponzio. I'm an assistant professor in modern European history and history of gender and sexuality at the University of Saskatchewan here. And I am also one of the people who are trying to revamp 2S LGBTQIA plus History Month Canada. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about this in a couple of seconds. But I really want to ask you also to visit the website that we put together here at the university. There is a spotlight at usask.ca where actually you can see what are the events going on at the moment at the university. And there are going to be many in the upcoming weeks. There are going to be movie nights. There is going to be a drug history meeting. So just check the website and see what is going on here at the university. And I also suggest that you follow our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter account so that you can get information about History Month here at the University of Saskatchewan, but also throughout Canada. So I want to thank, first of all the people who have been working together with me to put together all these events at the University of Saskatchewan. Luke Mueller, Anne Liang, Tasnim Jesse, Ksenia Pitskalny, and Brooke Kleiber, who actually is the person who put together the website for us. We have been actually a great team, and I really want to thank them. I want to thank also the Office of the Provost, the College of Arts and Science, the library, and my colleagues at the University of Saskatchewan in the History Department. Of course, Rachel is going to introduce herself pretty soon. And I also want to thank HUSA, which is the History Undergraduate Student Associations, because they work hard to promote us, and also Alec Lister Paramore, and The Sheaf, who is the magazine here at the university, who put together two very important articles, and more is coming. And for this, I really want to thank Beth Center, who is here. She's wonderful, and she's always been extremely supportive.
Recording in progress.
So what is History Month? History Month was created here in Canada in 2018 at McGill University by Miriam Bensley-Main, who is now also the other person who is working together with me to try to revamp and relaunch History Month here. The idea is basically to be sure that queer history, to LGBTQI history, goes out of the ivory tower, goes out of the university, goes out of academic institution, is actually able to talk to the public more broadly. So the idea is really to support public queer history and be sure that people are aware of this history and are also able to know more, overcome, stigma, overcome stereotypes. And we know that here in Canada at the moment we're having a lot of issues and troubles, as many other parts in the world. And so it's very important to think about this history. And so this is why we have this month, and this is why it's very important to celebrate And when Rodney Wilson in 1994 started, LGBT History Month in the US, was because he couldn't find in his history book any reference to queer history. And so his idea was, I want to be sure that people know about his history. And this is how he started this entire, movement somehow. Now there are many history months in the world, and so we hope that also Canada is going to become stronger and more connected, because otherwise there are many events happening without connection, without knowing actually what is going on. So this event today actually originates from my SSHRC research that is focused on transnational history and connections between queer people in 1950s Italy, Northern Europe, and North America. And in my own work, I've been dealing a lot with, international queer networks with the desire to migrate to more welcoming places, and also with human rights. So this is why I decided to organize this event to reflect somehow what I did, but also to see what other people are doing. And our presenters today have been working on these issues and are going to have different perspectives, so I'm really looking forward to listen to them. But before presenting them, I would like to introduce to all of you my partner here, my co-moderator. We're going to moderate today together this event, and it's Professor Rachel Loewen-Walker. And so I hope that you can introduce yourself a little bit.
Thank you so much, and hi, everyone. I had the good fortune of being invited without having to do the incredible background work that has gone into this event, and so thank you, Alessio, for the invitation to participate in this conversation. I teach in Women's and Gender Studies and in the College of Law and Political Studies at the University of Saskatchewan. And my research focuses on feminist and queer theories, gender and sexuality, in particular in relation to human rights, and with a deep focus on 2S LGBTQ organizations across Canada. And so absolutely, as I'm sure you can tell, that connects very much with the speakers we have today, including someone from an organization in Canada that works on human rights locally and internationally. So I really look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Rachel. So you're really the perfect person here. So I'm going to introduce each one of the presenters, and then each presenter is going to present. And then we're going to have a couple of questions, and then we're open up to people here, but also to people from home. So let me introduce the presenters. So Victor Manuel Machas Gonzalez is Professor of History, Race, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and serves as Faculty Fellow for Diversity and Inclusion in the College of Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities, and has worked at UWL for 24 years. He is president of the U.S.-Canada Association of Historians of Mexico and serves on the board of the Committee on LGBT Status in the Profession of the American Historical Association, the board of the Association for the History of Women and Gender in Mexico, and on the advisory board of Out History New York. He has received numerous recognitions and fellowships for his contributions in the area of diversity and inclusion, as well as for his historical research from the UW System Regents, Yale University, the University of Texas, the American Historical Association, and the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and the Council for Advancement of Support of Education, and in 2021 received the Wisconsin LGBTQ Leaders of Color Award. In 2017, he was named among Wisconsin's most influential Latino leaders. He serves as historical consultant for PBS Wisconsin and reviewed the Wisconsin History Center project of the Wisconsin Historical Society. The other presenter is Laura Belmonte. Laura Belmonte is Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences and Professor of History at Virginia Tech. She received her AB in History and Political Science from the University of Georgia and her MA and PhD in History from the University of Virginia. She's author of The International LGBT Right Movements, A History, published by Bloomsbury in 2021, and Selling the American Ways, U.S. Propaganda and the Cold War, published in 2008. She's also co-author of Global Americans, a Transnational U.S. History, published in 2018, and editor of Speaking of America, Readings in U.S. History, published in 2006. Thank you, Laura, for being here together with us. And finally, we have Swati Sekar. Swati has been running an immigration and refugee law practice in Tagaronto, I hope that I pronounced it correctly, with a focus on issues of detention and LGBTQ migrants. She recently closed her practice to take on a new position at Rainbow Railroad as the Director of Protection Initiatives. She strives to ground all of her work within larger movements for migrant justice and dignity. So thank you all for being here. And I think we're going to start with Victor. We're going to be somehow moving from transnational history to history of human rights to human rights in practice. Thank you. Can you hear us? Yes.
To our presenter,
Okay.
we can't hear you.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, now we can.
Okay. Okay. There we go. Sorry about that. You would think that after we were online teaching for a year or so during COVID that we would have mastered these processes. So I apologize for that. I'd like to talk a little bit about how I got to do this kind of research. I think it's more germane, I think, than a merely academic focus. So I'm going to share that with you. So since the early 2000s, I've worked with other academics on transnational histories that seek to debunk the centrality of the nation state and the nation in historical inquiry. I knew this not only because of my readings or my studies, but I knew this as a binational or transnational person. I grew up along the US border, where my family has thrived for centuries under various states that came and went, you know, the Viceroyalty and then Mexico and the US. And to be honest, also the native peoples that also were present in the area. Even today, I live in one state and I commute to work in another state. And yesterday, I was working on putting together a grant to translate a book and publish it in Mexico. So I have this as part of my experience, is living across boundaries. So growing up, I knew that nation-based explanations made no sense. And as an adult, and particularly as a Mexican-American gay academic and activist who works across North America, in the UK and Spain, I know that the world is more complex. In the book that we are co-editing, Laura, myself, and a colleague in Denmark, we want to take relations between countries, places, and groups as our point of departure to show that LGBT plus movements developed in transnational virtual or practical networks. In this perspective, I think deepens, expands, and develops our understanding of Two-Spirit LGBTQ plus activism and other networks. We want to challenge the methodological nationalism that's so common in LGBTQ history. I think in the early 90s, for example, we were so focused on the micro experience, the gay history of this city, the gay history of that city, and yet again, the history of this other city. And it took us a long time to synthesize and start looking for national patterns. And now we're moving beyond the national patterns, right? LGBT plus activism is often looked at as something that began in the US, then, you know, for some of us, something that began in the UK and the US, and they related, And then for other folks, something that really began in Germany and expanded before the war. There's lots of ways in which historians have looked at the birth of LGBTQ plus activism, and I think we're working to synthesize and make a sense of that, but also to complicate it, to see that it is something, as I will argue in the Mexican case, something that is much, much more complex, right? And that these ideas, these forms of resistance, this activism flowed back and forth between countries and places at different times, and that we can't give simple explanations, that we can't give unidirectional explanations of how these ideas flowed across international boundaries. So what we're trying to do then is to show them the richer and more diverse and complicated world that existed. So in my work as a historian of 19th and 20th century Mexico, I worked hard first to legitimize the history of same-sex attracted men. 2 decades ago, when I first started as a fresh PhD, no one did Mexican history on gays outside of the colonial period. The few scholars that did it from anthropology or sociology, but historians, no. I can tell you a very sad and yet funny story. The first person whose research I oversaw at the Jesuit University in Mexico City applied to the most important research institution in Mexico City. He was admitted, great scores, wonderful. All right, what are you going to research for your PhD? And he says, I'm going to study the history of homosexuality in Mexico City. Oh, no, we can't do that here. But if you would like, we can give you a certificate. A PhD, a certificate, not the same thing, right? So that has changed a lot. I just presided over the most important meeting of Mexican historians, and I made the keynote speaker, not me, someone else, focus on LGBT topics. Just weeks after important LGBTQ legislation was passed in Mexico. So things have changed a lot in the last 20 years in Mexico. But when I first started, I looked at elite gay Mexicans who wrote diaries, who published memoirs, and left behind correspondence. You know, the privilege left us a lot of records, so it was easier to do that kind of history. And I began to notice a lot of similarities between how gay community and identity first appeared in Mexico and how it appeared in New York, how it appeared in London, how it appeared in France, etc. And instead of continuing to stress that Mexican homosexuality was different, as most pioneers who worked from anthropology and sociology argued, I noticed that there were a lot of similarities. And for one thing, elite and even middle-class Mexican homosexuals read the same books as American gays, studied in the same schools in the US, in the UK, in Spain, and France, and they followed the same circuits. They had, in other words, the same kind of lives. They were just in different countries. Let me show you some images here because I'm falling behind on my images. So this is a great graphic that shows us how the correspondence of one particular gay activist in the US connected. And you see lots of connections across the oceans, but look at all the north-south connections that we see, and look at the important role of Mexico City as a regional hub as well, right? So when we start looking at these networks and these connections, we see that things are a lot more complicated, and it's not just a Northern European phenomenon. I noticed that the letters of Mexican gays studying and working at Yale or at Oxford or working in LA or Chicago, that these letters were transmitting knowledge of the gay world to their friends who remained behind in Mexico. And over time, I realized that there was a gay ghetto in Mexico City, and there were gay spaces there and practices and sensibilities. And when American or British or South American gays traveled to Mexico, they recorded that they saw these things. So all of that to say, there were a lot more similarities as soon as I started looking than I had realized that there were, right? The same practices, the same spaces across the Atlantic, on both sides of the Atlantic. I think sometimes we focus too much on how Mexico somehow seems to be an alien culture, and we forget that it is the oldest Western city in the Americas. And with that, it also means that all of those practices have also been transferred to the city, right? In the spaces and so on and so forth. And then I notice also that these same places where Mexicans met other Mexicans were also the places where Americans and other foreigners were meeting Mexicans, right? And so we got a lot of information from early gay guides. And the very first gay guide, it was something that was mimeographed. You know, today people hook up using the phone. Folks used to do this on paper. Okay, where do I go find another gay man to have a drink? Where do I find another gay man to have a talk? Where do I find another gay man to have sex with, right? And people were making these small little booklets, mimeographs. They were sharing, very small circulation, but they have a lot of information for historians. And one of the earliest ones from 1948, I'm going to share that one with you, not only had information for Mexico, but it had information on Saskatoon. So it's all the way down here. There's information on the gay history and the gay history of your town, right? So these materials are very rich materials that have been very useful to my research. And I also noticed that there was a lot of places that opened up in Mexico City between the wars. During the Second World War especially, a lot of the gay spaces from New York closed up and reopened in Mexico City. The most interesting one is Ada Bricktop's cafe in Mexico City, owned by an African-American woman and run and operated in Mexico City up through the 1950s. I also noticed that very early gay magazines, and here technically I want to explain something. We use the word homophile to talk about the earliest gay activists. We talk about this as something that happens between the 1940s through 1960s, when things change, and we then move on to what we call formally the homosexual liberation movement. So the homophile movement, for those of you that aren't familiar with this, is the precursor of gay rights, and it's active in the late 40s. Really, the high point is 50s and 60s, and they really began the process of publishing gay guidebooks, gay magazines, and so forth. And they challenged laws in the United States that tried to restrict the circulation of gay materials, and they won the court cases. So this is why we have gay magazines or gay websites and so on, because of the work of these people. Anyway, I looked at these magazines and I found a lot of information about Mexico. There really is quite an obsession by Americans with Latin America. And, you know, this is an erotic and fascination, and it goes both ways. Not only are Americans consuming Mexican bodies and other Europeans consuming Mexican bodies, but also Mexicans are consuming American bodies. So there's a fascination that goes both ways. It's not top down. Does not leave Mexicans without agency. It goes both ways. Very, very fascinating. These images come from American tourists collections that I've found. And then, you know, these publications, the most important of them is a publication called One, that began in 1953 and ended more or less in 1967. And I've tracked across there something like 78, 79 stories with a Mexican focus. And so there's a lot of material in these magazines. There's a lot of curiosity about Mexico there. And of course, when you look at the magazine, you can also see that it was sold in Mexico. The third entry here, Mexico City at the Librería de Cristal, in the most important government building for the arts in Mexico City. And the Librería de Cristal, here's a picture of it. It was 4 pavilions, 2-story pavilions, and it was a great novelty in that it was the first time that you could walk into a bookstore and browse. You could freely access the books. And so this created possibilities where there are gay-themed or homoerotic books. It creates the possibility of conversation, of meeting, of interaction around the book. Very different from the traditional Mexican book-selling experience where you walk into a store, you have to deal with a bookseller, they pull the book from the shelf and they give it to you. And there's not much of an opportunity to browse. Right. So in any case, this space also, it turns out, hosted cultural events that talked about homosexuality, sold books about homosexuality, and was used as a place to cruise, to meet other people. And it's located, you see here, the S-shaped building next to the big opera house with the cupola. And it's also right off of the main entertainment district. It's the equivalent of Times Square in Mexico. So it's also the place where most people are walking through. It's a high traffic place. It's a place where cruisers are meeting each other for sex, right? Well, I discovered that it wasn't the only magazine that published material on Mexico. The Mattachine Review also published material on Mexico. And both of these organizations had campaigns in 54 through 56 to attempt to organize gay activists in Mexico. That wasn't successful, but what did become very successful is that they were able to work with Mexican publishers, translating and making available to Americans many of those early books about homosexuality. So, for example, Webster Corey's book, The Homosexual in North America, appeared in the US in 52 and immediately in 1953 in Mexico, and it sold 3 times as many issues in Mexico than in the United States. Right. It features, most interestingly, at least for me, the first bilingual vocabulary list, detailing the vocabulary of the community, what's the top, what's the bottom, all kinds of information about what it means to be and practice homosexuality. And these books, to me, are fascinating. How is it that this important text, which only sells 2,000 copies in all of the United States and Great Britain, sells 6,000 in Mexico and rapidly begins to work on a second edition? So what was going on? How is it that this happens? And who are the people that make this kind of publication project happen? So I started paying a lot of attention to who were the publishers and who were the translators. And I discovered something that I was not expecting. These early homophile organizations were middle-class and working-class organizations. These homophile organizations did not have people talented in languages. These organizations consisted of mostly white males who only spoke English. So how is it that they created these things? Well, it turns out it was Latinos within the organization that created. And the most important one is this gentleman whose photograph is here, Gonzalo Segura, who went on to organize Mattachine Washington and really created much of the network that made possible gay rights campaigns in the 60s and 70s, and then disappeared, right? So it's a fascinating figure that I think we need to pay much more attention to. And what he reminds us of is that the world of publishing in Mexico City was very rich, was very complex, and many of us did not understand what was happening in Mexico City. Mexico City in the 50s and 60s, turns out, became the center of the international book trade in Spanish. it also has all of the infrastructure to print books cheaply, to illustrate books, and to distribute them. And it became a hub for the distribution of homophile activism and homophile ideas around the Spanish-speaking world. So I'm still working on finishing up my project, and I'll stop here and I'll be happy to share some more during the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Victor, for your presentation. I'm sure we're going to have a couple of questions for you later. And now we're going to have Laura presenting.
Okay. Need to share my screens. So I wrote a book, as Alessio mentioned, of what is the first synthesis on the history of the international LGBT rights movement. As Victor mentioned, there are a lot of books that tell the story of one city or one nation. And I thought it was time to try to do a kind of overarching narrative that would be approachable to general audiences. And that book was a real pleasure and labor of love in many ways. Because that covers such a long swath of territory, I thought I would focus a bit more specifically today and talk about U.S. foreign policy and LGBT rights. Of course, there are a ton of acronyms that are in the literature: LGBTI, LGBTQI. I'm using LGBT just for the sake of brevity today. So, there we go. The global landscape of international LGBT rights is fraught with geopolitical complexities and stark contrast. As of December 2020, 123 of the 193 member states of the United Nations had legalized consensual same-sex sexual acts, but at least 67 countries criminalized such behavior, including 6 nations that imposed the death penalty. Another 26 states punished same-sex sexual acts with a range of sentences, including short-term incarceration, corporal punishment, and life imprisonment. While 35 countries have legalized same-sex marriage and 81 have non-discrimination protections for gays and lesbians, 42 nations have so-called morality laws that restrict freedom of expression relating to sexual orientation and gender identity, usually under the guise of protecting youth, or propaganda laws modeled on Russia's June 2013 law banning the promotion of homosexuality and advocacy for LGBT equality. These triumphs and challenges reflect a long arc of transnational LGBT advocacy efforts dating from the mid-19th century to the present day. It is a trajectory that has involved individuals, in informal networks, non-governmental organizations, and states who have not always worked in concert and who often meet resistance from a similar constellation of actors determined to stop the global movement for LGBT equality. International LGBT advocacy arose at a time when women's rights, environmental concerns, disability rights, and racial and ethnic equality were becoming part of global human rights discourse. The International Gay Association, IGA, was founded in August 1978 during the conference of the Campaign for Homosexual Equality in Coventry, England, at a meeting attended by 30 men representing 17 organizations from 14 countries. It changed its name to the International Lesbian and Gay Association in 1986. In 1990, the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission was founded. In 1991, at the urgings of the ILGA and Demet Demir, a Turkish transgender woman being harassed by the police, Amnesty International began including persecuted gays under its definition of prisoners of conscience. Other human rights groups like Human Rights Watch and Human Rights First followed suit and encompassed anti-LGBT abuses into their purview. While U.S. citizens have played leading roles in the establishment and governance of global LGBTI advocacy organizations, the United States government, despite its professed commitment to global human rights, became an advocate for international LGBT rights only relatively recently. Indeed, as evidenced by the Lavender Scare in the early Cold War, expulsions of gays and lesbians from the U.S. Armed Forces, which did not officially end until late 2010, and interpretations of U.S. immigration laws that authorize the exclusion and deportation of homosexuals on the grounds of psychopathic personality and sexual deviancy, a practice upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in Baudelaire v. INS in 1967 and not repealed until 1990. The U.S. government has often actively repressed LGBTI people. Although the United States legalized same-sex marriage in 2015, and the Supreme Court ruled in June 2020 that employment discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity is illegal under Title VII of the Federal Civil Rights Act, that has not precluded the introduction and passage in several cases of a wave of anti-LGBT legislation in recent months, much of which specifically targets transgender people. Compared to many European and Latin American nations, the U.S. record on LGBTI rights is incomplete and comparatively late. It was under the Clinton administration that the State Department took tentative steps toward improving America's record on international LGBTI issues. In 1994, U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno directed immigration officers and courts to treat as precedent a Board of Immigration Appeals decision that granted a gay Cuban man asylum on the basis that he faced persecution in his home country simply because of his status as a homosexual, not because of conduct. Matter of Toboso Alfonso was pivotal in establishing that a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of sexual orientation is a valid basis for making a claim for asylum in the United States. The Clinton years also witnessed openly LGBTI individuals playing a more visible role in U.S. diplomacy. In 1997, President Clinton nominated James Hormel, the openly gay philanthropist and heir to the meatpacking dynasty, as the U.S. ambassador to Luxembourg. The nomination drew bipartisan support, but died in the Senate in October 1998 after the Republican Majority Leader, Trent Lott, refused to let it go up for a full Senate vote. That same year, Lott had publicly declared that gays were sinners who, like kleptomaniacs or alcoholics, could overcome their affliction. The Traditional Values Coalition declared Hormel unacceptable to the predominantly Catholic Luxembourg after finding sexually explicit materials at a research center named for him at the San Francisco Public Library. However, these attempts to derail Hormel's nomination failed. The library explained that Hormel had provided a $500,000 donation to underwrite its LGBTI collections, but had nothing to do with its acquisition process. Luxembourg, which had abolished its laws against consensual same-sex conduct in the 1800s, said it would welcome Hormel as an envoy. Accordingly, Clinton renominated Hormel in early 1999 and then made a recess appointment. In June 1999, he was sworn in and became the first openly gay American to secure an ambassadorial post. Although LGBTI diplomats remained visible during the presidency of George W. Bush, the administration did not champion LGBTI rights globally. In 2001, diplomat Michael Guest became the first openly LGBTI person confirmed by the Senate for an ambassadorial post and went on to serve for 3 years as U.S. ambassador to Romania. At a swearing-in ceremony 6 years later, then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice described the mother of the same-sex partner of a diplomat as his mother-in-law. But such acceptance usually stopped at America's shores. For example, on June 18, 2006, Won Kim, Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, told the United Nations Human Rights Committee that the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ratified by the United States in 1992, did not protect consensual same-sex relations, an assertion running counter to long-established precedents and refuted by members of the UN committee. Although the State Department's annual human rights reports continued tracking LGBTI concerns in dozens of countries, 115 of the world's 186 countries in 2006, this reporting did not translate into significant U.S. action. Contemporaneously, activists recognized the need for a legal framework for stopping human rights abuses of LGBTI people around the world. In November 2006, experts gathered in Yogyakarta, Java, and unanimously agreed on a set of 29 principles. The Yogyakarta principles identified pervasive patterns of discrimination and violence against LGBTI people and made specific recommendations for actions that the United Nations, states, NGOs, the media, and human rights groups can take to ensure full equality of LGBTI people everywhere. On March 26, 2007, the final version of the Yogyakarta Principles was released at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. In December 2008, inspired by these principles, 66 mostly European and Latin American countries supported a French-sponsored UN declaration calling for the decriminalization of homosexuality. But the United States joined China, Russia, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Organization of the Islamic Conference in opposing the non-binding measure. Adopting a dramatically different position, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton made international LGBTI rights an integral element of the U.S. global agenda for human rights. In November 2009, on the eve of World AIDS Day, Clinton announced that the United States would not tolerate the criminalization of homosexuality in nations receiving U.S. aid aimed at combating HIV/AIDS. Her statement coincided with weeks of private U.S. diplomatic efforts to persuade Ugandan officials to kill pending legislation imposing the death penalty for those who repeatedly engaged in gay sex or exposed others to HIV. At a June 2010 State Department celebration of LGBTI Month, Clinton emphasized that the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor tracked the treatment of LGBTI people in its country-specific human rights reports, and that it had begun offering emergency aid to human rights activists in Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East at risk because of their LGBTI status or pro-LGBTI advocacy. Quote, just as I was very proud to say the obvious more than 15 years ago in Beijing that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights, Clinton declared. Well, let me say today that human rights are gay rights and gay rights are human rights. In June 2011, in contrast to the Bush administration's opposition to a similar resolution that failed in 2008, the Obama administration's UN envoys joined 85 nations in passing a South African-sponsored resolution condemning anti-LGBTI violence and discrimination, a first for the United Nations Human Rights Council. President Barack Obama spoke before the United Nations General Assembly 3 months later and asserted, "No country should deny people their rights to freedom of speech and freedom of religion, but also no country should deny people their rights because of who they love, which is why we must stand up for the rights of gays and lesbians everywhere." No sitting U.S. president had ever before offered such unequivocal support for global LGBTI equality. On December 5th, 2011, Obama and Clinton formalized steps elevating international LGBTI rights as a priority in U.S. foreign policy. Obama issued a presidential memorandum directing all agencies engaged abroad to ensure that U.S. diplomacy and foreign assistance promoted and protected the human rights of LGBTI people. Obama ordered intensified efforts to combat the criminalization of homosexual identity or conduct, to fight anti-LGBTI discrimination, to protect LGBTI refugees and asylum seekers, and to ensure, quote, swift and meaningful U.S. responses to human rights abuses of LGBTI persons abroad. On the same day, Clinton addressed the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva and announced the creation of a new $3 million Global Equality Fund to support the work of NGOs working on international LGBTI issues. While neither Clinton nor Obama vowed to tie U.S. foreign aid to a nation's record on LGBTI equality, the symbolism of their statements was nonetheless powerful. John Kerry, Clinton's successor as Secretary of State, expanded America's global LGBTI equality initiatives. In April 2013, U.S. aid launched the LGBTI Global Development Partnership, a $16 million private-public partnership that promoted LGBTI rights around the world over the next 4 years. In February 2015, Kerry appointed Randy Berry, an openly gay longtime Foreign Service officer, to be the first special envoy to promote global LGBTI rights. Over the next year, he traveled to 42 countries. At the same time, the United States and several other nations continued pushing the United Nations to integrate LGBTI equality into global human rights conventions and treaties. In August 2015, the UN Security Council received its first ever briefing on LGBTI issues at a meeting co-hosted by the United States and Chile. It followed the June 2015 release of a report by the UN Commissioner for Human Rights that found that thousands of people had been horrifically injured or killed worldwide because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. The campaign made steady progress. In June 2016, following a joint campaign led by 628 NGOs from 151 countries, about 70% of which were from the Global South, the United Nations Human Rights Council voted 23-18 with 6 abstentions to create an independent expert charged with monitoring anti-LGBT violence and discrimination around the world. It was the United Nations' strongest demonstration to date of a commitment to integrating sexual orientation and gender identity into international human rights law. While the steps taken to forge a global consensus on LGBT equality are quite remarkable, It is clear there is much more to be done to ensure the safety and protection of LGBT people worldwide. One might hope that the story of LGBT equality globally is a progress narrative that ends with acceptance of non-heteronormative and non-binary people everywhere, but the future is riddled with uncertainty. The rapidity with which gains can be reversed has been potently demonstrated by the United States. While campaigning in the Republican presidential primaries in April 2016, Donald Trump opposed same-sex marriage, but nonetheless presented himself as an advocate for LGBT rights. On June 12th, Omar Mateen, a 29-year-old security guard, killed 49 people and wounded 53 others in a mass shooting at Pulse, a gay dance club in Orlando, Florida. Mateen, a Muslim born in the United States to Afghan immigrant parents, had vowed his allegiance to the Islamic State of the Levant and Iraq, ISIS, in a 911 call made during the shooting. 2 days later, Trump, by then the Republican nominee, condemned ISIS for throwing men assumed to be gay off buildings. He claimed that his proposed ban on the immigration of Muslims would protect the freedoms and beliefs of LGBT Americans more robustly than any policy espoused by Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton. Trump aligned himself with anti-Muslim activists like Dutch politician Geert Wilders and blogger Pamela Geller, who pointed to persecution and violence against LGBT people by Islamic extremists as justification for immigration restrictions. Trump's use of the Pulse massacre, one of the deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history, to promote homo-nationalism and nativism outraged many LGBT activists who noted that most of the Pulse victims were Hispanic. Skepticism about Trump's professed commitment to LGBT rights proved justified. After Trump won the presidency, his administration embarked on a systematic reversal of pro-LGBT executive orders and federal policy changes made by the Obama administration. In addition to reinstituting a ban on transgender people serving in the U.S. Armed Forces, the Trump administration rolled back expanded protections in adoption, healthcare, education, housing, and federal contracting. In October 2019, lawyers from the U.S. Department of Justice appeared before the Supreme Court and argued that the provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that outlaw sex discrimination did not encompass sexual orientation or gender identity. The Supreme Court ruled against this argument, as I mentioned, in June 2020. But at the same time, the Trump administration attempted to present itself as a champion of international LGBT rights. In a June 2019 tweet marking LGBT Pride Month, Trump claimed that his administration had launched a global campaign to decriminalize homosexuality in 70 countries, an announcement initially made by Richard Grenell, Trump's openly gay ambassador to Germany. But at the same time, the Trump administration was rejecting requests from U.S. embassies asking to fly the rainbow flag on official flagpoles outside their buildings, an annual LGBT Pride Month gesture that had become routine since Hillary Clinton had declared that gay rights are human rights in 2011. Some U.S. diplomats and international LGBT rights advocates interpreted the move as a signal that the United States was abandoning its recent leadership role in advancing global LGBT equality. They remained skeptical even after Trump addressed the UN in September 2019 and declared, "We stand in solidarity with LGBTQ people who live in countries that punish, jail, or execute individuals based on sexual orientation." Pointing to Trump's assaults on domestic LGBT rights and the U.S. refusal to grant visas to gay and bisexual men fleeing human rights abuses in Chechnya, Many LGBT activists accuse Trump of dishonesty and hypocrisy. Trump's polarizing presidency and its contradictory rhetoric and actions were part of a larger wave of right-wing populism that has imperiled LGBT rights in several nations. Although resurgent right-wing populism has contributed to increases in violence against racial, religious, and sexual minorities in several countries, there is also cause for cautious optimism. India, in September 2018, its Supreme Court struck down Section 377, which had originated under British colonial law in 1861 and spread through the empire. And so did this ruling. There have been several challenges to sodomy laws, including in Kenya in May 2019, which upheld its sodomy law, but a month later, Botswana struck its down. This was a landmark ruling in Africa where more than 30 countries have laws prohibiting homosexual relations, and in some nations, including Sudan and parts of Somalia and Nigeria, homosexuality is punishable by death. And after its initial failure to enact the so-called Kill the Gays bill, Uganda passed that legislation earlier this year, and it is having horrific and immediate impact. Another ruling with sweeping dimensions occurred in 2018 when the Inter-American Court of Human Rights ruled that the American Convention on Human Rights mandates and requires the legalization of same-sex marriage. The ruling was fully binding on Costa Rica, and now there are several dozen countries who are in the process of figuring out how or if they will abide this ruling. In 2019, Taiwan became the first nation in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage. And then that same month, despite the transnational anti-LGBT movement's attacks on gender ideology, which is a rhetorical device used to encapsulate hostility toward gender equity, transgenderism, and reproductive justice, the World Health Organization removed gender identity disorder from its list of mental illnesses, a major landmark in the global quest for transgender rights. So there is a powerful and continued coexistence of significant victories and daunting challenges that have underscored the international LGBT rights movement throughout its history. Although the ultimate outcome of the global quest for global equality remains uncertain, courageous LGBT activists will undoubtedly continue for fighting for love, dignity, safety, and living one's truth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura, for your presentation. Also, we are going to have, I think, a couple of questions later. And really, thank you. And we have now the last speaker, who is Swati. So I think, I don't know, are we going to have her?
Can everybody?
Okay, yes. Now we can see you. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, great. And can you see my screen as well?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, hi everybody. Thank you so much, Laura and Victor, for your pieces. It was super interesting to hear and really helpful framing, I think, for some of the things that I want to be talking about. So yes, as you heard in the introduction, my name is Swati. I go by she, her. I work at Rainbow Railroad. My background is as a refugee lawyer. I am not at all an academic, but I do take a lot of interest in all the deep dives that everybody's taking on these issues. And so today I am going to be just talking a lot about the work that Rainbow Railroad actually does and bringing it back to some of the current situations of human rights violations and persecution against the LGBT community internationally and grounding that in the work that we do. So just as a starting point, so as I said in my bio, I am based out of Toronto or Takaranto, which is the traditional and current Indigenous territories of many different people, including the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe people, the Haudenosaunee, Chippewa Nation and the Mississaugas of the New Credit. Also, as an urban center, we have lots of different Indigenous communities that migrate here that are Inuit, Cree, and Métis. And this territory that we are on is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. And so I've put up a map here of a pre-contact map of the Dish with One Spoon territory. So before contact with settler colonialists. And this is now Southern Ontario, which stretches from the Great Lakes to Quebec and Lake Simcoe into the US. So I've gotten this map from a 4-part webinar series by Laurie Gallant called Facing Canada, which I definitely encourage you to check out. And she explains in the context of this map that before contact with settlers, Indigenous nations were roaming freely across Turtle Island, which we now know as North America. Communities were nomadic and semi-nomadic, and their movement patterns were governed by weather, seasons, where they needed to go to collect medicines. And nations, as they were living their lives, were coming up against each other, having agreements, disagreements, battles. And so they decided to come together to negotiate an agreement about how they traveled over the land, how they moved through the territories, and how they related to each other and requested consent when they were passing through other territories. And that is the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. And in that treaty, there's this fundamental principle that nobody owns the land. And we all have a right to live here and travel here as we need to travel. And the reason that I bring this up in advance of this conversation we're about to have is to just remember that migration has always existed. Humans have always migrated across this world in terms of where we need to go to survive. And not just humans, but all animals, right? Like that's what they do. So that's something important to remember. And the other thing I love about this map is the borders. So what you can see here is that these borders are not defined by firm lines. They're overlapping, they're flexible, and they're porous based on the needs and lived realities of the people living on this land. And at the core of Rainbow Railroad's work is, of course, working towards and dreaming about a world where queer and trans people can live freely as their true selves in whatever land they consider to be home without fear of persecution. But we also know that that's not the current state of the world, as Laura was mentioning. And so in the meantime, Rainbow Railroad is supporting people's right to migrate, the right to move freely and where they need to move for safety and for survival and for well-being and for happiness. And so as we move through this conversation, I just want to invite everyone to think about borders and think about the fact that actually the Canadian border as we know it, as well as many other borders internationally, are fiction. They were created by settler colonialists, usually, almost always without the consent of Indigenous community. And so I would just invite folks to question the legitimacy of not only Canadian borders, but borders writ large when we think about our international movements for migration. So this is just a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about today in my presentation. And as I move through this content, just two kind of reminders or things to bring forward. The first is that, you know, some of the things we're talking about are difficult. It's like, as Laura was saying, and even looking at the history of what Victor was talking about, queers have experienced painful things for a long time and are continuing to experience a lot of really, really difficult and very heartbreaking, tragic situations. So please, you know, as you're listening, take whatever care you need for yourself if you are feeling impacted by that. And then, of course, the other side of this, which Laura also mentioned in her presentation, is that even though things are hard, queers are just like so resilient, so creative. They are resisting and fighting back against oppression in every possible way. They're supporting each other and they're liberating not only themselves, but other people. It's really, really inspiring. And there are really a lot of things to celebrate. So I just wanted to bring that forward as well. Okay, so Rainbow Railroad, in case you haven't heard of us, here's just like a little bit of brief background on our history. So it's been around since about 2006. It was originally formed by a group of volunteers and it was run by the volunteers, queer and trans activists, human rights defenders who saw the state of LGBT rights, not just at home, but internationally particularly, and wanted to do something about that persecution. And the name Rainbow Railroad is in reference to the Underground Railroad, which of course everybody here will know is a pathway to safety that was created for slaves who were escaping, Black folks who were escaping enslavement in the American South. The work of Rainbow Railroad is fundamentally grounded in the experiences of the people that we're helping and supporting. And so we're constantly working with folks who are experiencing persecution or who are supporting other people on the ground to have that information and those experiences lead us, guide us, and shape the programming that we put forward. And then finally, Rainbow Railroad fundamentally is grounded and focused on queer liberation and queering the humanitarian system, as we call it. So queer liberation, of course, is just the liberation of all queers for us to be able to live and be however we want to. And then when we think about queering the humanitarian system, I think, again, I think this came up through the past conversations, but the system as it exists, the humanitarian system as it exists, is very, very heteronormative. It has a super heteronormative framework, really, really restrictive, really, really exclusionary. And so when we are trying to approach humanitarian work as an organization, we are trying to adopt a much more expansive lens of what it means to be free, what it means to have family, what it means to find safety. So that is some of our grounding philosophy that underpins all the work that we're doing. So I'm going to breeze through this next part because I think Laura provided some really great background context of what's going on internationally. But here's a sense of where we're at in terms of criminalization worldwide. I think this source is Human Dignity Trust. I saw another source that said it's actually 64 jurisdictions now that are criminalizing private consensual same-sex activity. The one thing I want to highlight about this is that almost half of the jurisdictions that do criminalize are Commonwealth jurisdictions. What that tells me is that there is a really clear link between colonialism and persecutory homophobic laws. A lot of places, like India, for example, pre-colonial history, we had a very expansive view of gender, of same-sex relationships. Even though there may have been cultural taboos, it was not codified and it was not so entrenched as it is now. And so I think it's just important to really note that a lot of societies actually had really liberatory frameworks for queerness that were then suppressed and restricted through colonial mechanisms. So also this map that shows a little bit about criminalization by region and how criminalization rates have been progressing over the last few decades. So we can see that decriminalization has, and this is actual numbers, so it's not percentage, it's the number of countries per year that are decriminalizing. So we can see that, you can read this a few ways. I mean, the rate of decriminalization has been steadily decreasing for the last several decades. But I think that the way to read that is that there are also less countries that are actually criminalizing same-sex activity. And so less countries, there's sort of less of a pool from which to be decriminalizing, if that makes sense. But I think what's also important to note about this figure is that even though the pace is incremental, like I think, again, from your presentation, Laura, like we see like every step of the way, there's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So changes are incremental, but they are happening. So like there has actually been steadily every year 1 to 2 countries that are decriminalizing these laws. And so this activity. So that's good. I think that's something to be optimistic about, even if the rate is slow. Just for your information, the most recent country to decriminalize is Singapore, which just happened, I think, last month in August. Okay, so the other thing I just want to note, of course, is that, you know, when we're talking about persecution of queer people, criminalization is really just one aspect of it, right? And just because a country legalizes same-sex sexual acts, that doesn't mean that it's safer for people who are living there. It might contribute to that, but it certainly doesn't mean that, because unfortunately, there are so many other forms of persecutory and discriminatory treatment that queers might face. So laws of general application that disproportionately affect queer folks. So there's a law about freedom of assembly. Maybe it's only being enforced when it comes to gatherings of LGBTQ people. We know that sex work laws, for example, really disproportionately impact trans folks and trans women in particular. And then, of course, there are there's still so much stigma and issues accessing a wide range of survival-based services. So housing, having safe living situations, medical care, education, employment, access to public spaces, family status, parental rights. All of that stuff are still really big barriers that people have, even though they might live in a place where same-sex relationships have been decriminalized. And so some folks might be experiencing one of these things, and then some folks might be experiencing all of these things, which might cumulatively amount to persecution. Okay, so that is a little bit of the context. Now I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what Rainbow Railroad actually does as an organization in our day-to-day work programmatically. So this is a wheel, a program wheel that was developed to kind of show how our programming and strategic advocacy goals are shaped. So the first thing you're going to see is the center of this diagram, which is red, and it says Emergency Travel Support, or ETS. This is Rainbow Railroad's core program, and the program of ETS essentially provides life-saving resources and travel support to help LGBT folks who are persecuted to access pathways to other countries. So it's effectively giving them resources to find pathways to safety through a third country or a second country. So through that program, we'd provide direct financial support to individuals from the time that we contact them or they contact us until they arrive in a safer country. We might also provide them with support in claiming asylum and going through that process. So that's our core program, ETS. A component of ETS is this first program you see, Program 1 in the green, which is cash assistance. So unfortunately, for many of the people who reach out to us, there is no option for them to get out of their country or to find a route to safety. So people face a lot of barriers that I'm going to get into about just being able to have mobility, the right of freedom to movement and the right to cross an international border. And so for people who don't have an option to access emergency travel support and get to a different country, and for places specifically where there are no local organizations that have a presence that can support them, Rainbow Railroad would step in to provide direct cash assistance to people who need it for their survival. So for basic needs, for accommodation, to access medical care, to relocate within the country, maybe away from the people who are persecuting them. So although this is a Band-Aid solution for the deeper underlying problems, this really can be life-saving support for a lot of people who just desperately need money to be able to get themselves to a safer situation. The other program area that we have here, Program 2, is partnership development. So this is a really important and core part of Rainbow Railroad's programming, where effectively as an organization, we team up and collaborate with local grassroots organizations, human rights defenders, and activist networks that are positioned on the ground in countries where people are experiencing persecution. So we partner with them to get information, to get data and insight into what people are experiencing, to get logistical support if we're trying to support somebody in getting out of the country, and also to support them in their own programming to uplift and support LGBTQ folks. So they might be, for example, offering healthcare support. Those organizations might be offering safe houses for queer people or providing legal advocacy. So we would actually partner with those organizations and potentially fund them and support them in their work to kind of build capacity and strengthen those networks on the ground. A third area that we have is crisis response. So as an organization, we monitor and respond to sudden state-sponsored persecution against LGBTQ individuals. So crisis situations can emerge in a variety of situations. So it might be political instability, there could be mass detentions or mass arrests of LGBTQ people and crackdowns that are happening. So through monitoring the data and leveraging our partnerships with human rights defenders and organizations on the ground, we can respond to crises. So we can provide ETS support to potentially get people out of the country. We can try to find pathways to safety. We can give cash assistance to people in imminent danger. And so that is something that is another core part of our programming. recently, and I'm going to get into this, but some of the crises we've responded to are the Ukraine crisis, Afghanistan, when the Taliban came back into power in August of 2021. That created a huge crisis for LGBT people. And then, as Laura mentioned, Uganda, very sadly, which just adopted the Kill the Gays bill, as it's known. And this has had a very serious ripple effect throughout the region. And it is a situation of crisis that we're actively monitoring. The fourth program that you see there in the orange, Information Services and Referral. So this is a very expanding part of Rainbow Railroad's programming, but this is effectively where we provide mental health support and advice to LGBTQ folks who are either we are helping through our organization who are experiencing violence and persecution elsewhere. And we might be able to refer them to other services that they need to get the kind of support that they need. But mental health, as you can imagine, is a huge thing for folks who are dealing with this kind of persecution day in, day out, and the trauma of migration in general. So we're really trying to step up our programming in this area and provide that kind of life-saving support, quite literally, to stop people from taking their lives. And then the final program area I'll just discuss on this wheel is complementary pathways. So as I mentioned, there are some folks who just really have no options to get out of their country, to go to a different country through emergency travel support, for example. And so complementary pathways is really exploring government-sponsored pathways. So we have relationships with different governments, the Canadian government, as well as some governments in the EU and as well the US government. And so working with government stakeholders to explore these pathways for people who are particularly vulnerable and who have literally no other options to try to get out of their situations. So that is our core programming. We also do a lot of advocacy work. So Rainbow Railroad is expanding exponentially. So I recently joined the organization, and we're constantly growing in our program areas. And so we do lots of broad range advocacy as well. So for example, we are in the process of launching a 2-year project called the Forced Displacement Network, which is the creation of a dedicated international coordination mechanism to make an LGBTQ network of safety for forcibly displaced LGBTQ folks. And so it would be basically creating a platform where we have different roundtables to kind of determine what the issues are, how are the ways that we can support people, where are the transit points for folks, what kind of strategies can we leverage to try to protect ourselves and protect each other. We also do a lot of media and government advocacy. Recently, we were party to a legal challenge to the Safe Third Country Agreement for immigrants or refugees, rather, who are passing through the United States and coming to Canada. So if we see there being alignment with our work on some legal challenges, we'll always step in to do that. And then we have lots of partnerships with UN and other international bodies. We also partner quite a bit with the US and also with EU partners. Okay, so what does our work look like? What are we seeing? What are some of the trends? So the major trend that I will say is that we are getting more and more requests for help every single year. So you can see from this graph briefly that only goes up to 2022 that the number of people requesting help from us is increasing at an exponential rate. The 2022 numbers are already a bigger jump than what you see from 2021 to 2022. And one of the things that we're seeing quite a bit in 2023 is a huge increase in requests for help from the United States. So the US is actually now it's our third top country behind Afghanistan and Uganda. The third number of requests for help, high number, is from the US, from individuals, very sadly, who are fleeing anti-trans legislation. It's directly correlated, the spikes that we get in our requests for help, directly correlated to the passing of various states' anti-trans legislation. It is really sad because honestly, we can't help people from the US. It doesn't fall within our mandate. And so, we are trying to figure out as an organization, what is the strategy for supporting people and directing them to the right places? But in any case, lots of people are asking for help, and that number is projected to go up. And I think there's a few ways to read that. I mean, first of all, Rainbow Railroad, as I said, is expanding. And so as an organization, we've also increased in our visibility and our reach. So I think more people have heard about us and more people are reaching out. But I think it's also fair and unfortunate to say that the situation around the world is bad. It's still bad. Lots of people are in a really bad situation, and so they are desperately reaching out for our help. I've just included 3 graphs here that show a little bit, give you a sense of how our program areas are being enacted in 2022. So the first graph, you see the circle here at the top left, where you have partnership type of individual supported. So this is our partnership development. So when we're working with other grassroots organizations on the ground, and you can see there, these are the kinds of things that those organizations are doing. So they're doing shelter work, they're doing relocation support, and then we are supporting those organizations. Underneath there, you can see the kinds of information services and referrals that we're doing. And so, we write letters of support, we provide emotional support, we provide referrals to other organizations. And then you can see here on the right, these are some of our responses to crises, which is one of our program areas I mentioned. So Ukraine, we responded to. Afghanistan, we did respond to and continue to respond to. Mexico refers to the crisis when there were migrants that were trapped at the Mexico-US border, and a lot of LGBTQ folks there were facing a lot of persecution. And so we were supporting some people in that situation. And then Chad reflects the attempted coup attempt. I think it was in 2022 or 2021, I can't recall, but there was a big crackdown there that we also were monitoring and supported with. Okay, so who's asking us for support? What kinds of people are asking us for support, and who's receiving that support? So this is a chart that shows some of that by gender identity. And what you can see here is that the majority of people that are asking for support and receiving support are cis men. So we are not uncritical of that. That is something we're very, very well aware of. And I also think there's a few ways to read that. Primarily, it's because of access, right? So cis gay men, typically within the acronym, the 2S LGBTQIA acronym, or the SOGIESC identity, tend to be more privileged than other groups of people. So they tend to have more access to just resources and more access to even be able to communicate with Rainbow Railroad. Absolutely more access to mobility. So not needing, for example, being able to travel alone as a single man, being able to access passports with less scrutiny and cross over international borders. So something that we're trying to do as an organization is really think through the ways in which we can reach people who might be less likely to be able to access our services by gender identity and also by SOGIESC identity. So again, we see here that a lot of folks that we are supporting tend to be identifying as gay. So that ends up being cis gay men that we typically support and or we end up supporting, and then other people that are just unable to reach us for whatever reason. So that's something operationally we're thinking about a lot, and making sure that we are trying to actively prioritize folks, especially women and trans folks who may really have no other ways to get out and who are really in desperate need of help. Just really briefly for interest, this is some of the ages of the people that we were supporting in 2022. And so a lot of folks are really between the ages of 18 and 45. So that's a pretty big range. Then turning to the regions where people are asking for support. So this is again just by region, not by country, but you can see we're getting in 2022, these are 2022 figures, a lot of people from South and Central Asia. What's really accounting for that large number is the Afghanistan crisis. So we really helped a large number of people from Afghanistan in 2022 and 2021, and in 2023, to be honest. Middle East and North Africa also comprises a large amount of people, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. And then this is by country instead of by region. So you can see here from 2022, these were our top 10 countries of request. For 2023, number 3 on there, it's Afghanistan, Uganda, and the USA for our top countries of request. And then we also have top nationalities of request. So the reason that there's a distinction here is because a lot of the folks who come to Rainbow Road for help are actually outside of their country of origin already. So they might be Afghans who have fled to Pakistan just to get out of their own situation. We have a lot of Syrian people who have fled to Turkey. We have a lot of Ugandans who are in Kenya or Kenyans who are in Uganda. So we track both the nationality of the individual as well as the place that they are currently located. And then where are people going when they are asking for help and we're trying to relocate them? So some people might be going to Canada, the US, or Europe, but this is actually, a relatively small proportion of the number of people that actually end up relocating, because as you may probably already guess, these are the hardest places to get to. They are extremely difficult to travel to. We really, really police borders hard in North America and Western Europe. And our systems are extremely exclusionary, particularly against Black and Brown people, but also people from certain regions or countries. Only some people are really desirable for Canada and other places, in my view. And then when you add queerness or gender nonconformity to the mix, it becomes even less accessible for people to travel there. So oftentimes, due to these restrictions on freedom of movement, barriers to seeking asylum or resettlement, people often find that their only option is to flee to another country that's quote unquote safer for them, but it's still not completely safe. So we have temporary transit points, and I put temporary in quotes because people get stuck there for years. So it's ostensibly temporary, but really people are often trapped in transit countries. So in the African region, a lot of people migrate to South Africa. Within South America, Argentina and Brazil are major hubs. In the Middle East, Turkey is a big hub. And then, but sadly, you think about it, and despite how persecutory it is in Uganda, for example, or Pakistan, people are, or Iran, people are still going there to seek safety from their own persecutory environments. So that really tells you a lot about what the kinds of struggles that people are experiencing when they're trying to leave their countries. So they're really just kind of out of the frying pan into the fire in a lot of ways. And I will get into that a little bit more in the next section. Just briefly, when we talk about another thing that Rainbow Railroad tracks is health and welfare concerns of people who are coming forward. So as I mentioned before, we are trying to really find a much more expansive view of safety, of health, of happiness, of wellness. And so these are some of the health and welfare concerns that we are currently tracking and that might impact the kind of support that we provide to that person. And then these are some of the safety concerns that we are also hearing and tracking. And of course, if we hear new things, we're going to add that and continue to track that. But you can see this is some of the things that people are experiencing one or more of. These are some of the things that people reported. So in terms of health and welfare concerns that were reported in 2021 and 2022, you can see some pretty similar trends. Like risk of suicide is always a really big thing for a lot of folks, mental health concerns, inability to meet their basic needs, and homelessness, discrimination in employment or lack of income. And then in terms of safety concerns, again, a lot of the same trends year to year, but family-based violence, a lot of other forms of life-threatening violence, community and family-based rejection, sexual violence. So these are some of the safety concerns, unfortunately, that a lot of people are experiencing. And then just going back to that definition of safety, so reiterating that, as an organization, we are trying to really take the lead of people who are in these experiences and trying to really get a strong understanding for them. What does it mean to be safe? And for queer people, that's going to mean something so different for each and every person. And so this is just these are two quotes from our annual report last year showing some of people's expression of what safety means to them. And then what are the barriers that we are facing in our work? So I think you've heard me hopefully say this loud and clear, but our systems are exclusionary. They are discriminatory. In fact, our international refugee system is premised on exclusion. Our definition of what constitutes a refugee or what constitutes persecution is extremely narrow. So we have to kind of think outside of these international systems a lot of the time. One of the major issues that we have is lack of passport mobility. So you may not know this, for those of us who are privileged enough to have Canadian or US or EU passports, it's something that doesn't often come up. But some people in some parts of the world, first of all, can barely get a passport, but their passports basically are a red flag. So there are certain countries in particular where it's almost impossible to get a visa or to travel. So those countries right now are Pakistan, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Somalia. So if you're from one of those countries, good luck. Good luck getting a visa. Good luck crossing an international border. And as you see from this quote that I've pulled here from our annual report again, someone's just saying, you know, they didn't even bother to look at my name. They just saw the color of my passport and told me that I couldn't board. So this is a big issue. And these people faced persecution not only on their Sojiask identity, but also based on their nationality. And they really have very limited options to find safety. And then we have something that we called failed travel within the organization. Something that I learned a lot about once I started working here was the complicity of airline officials and airports in preventing people from seeking safety and from seeking asylum. So what we consider to be failed travel is when airline officials, so somebody's got a ticket, we have their route planned out, they're going to go to Guyana, and then they're going to go to Argentina, and then they're going to go to Cabo Verde, and then they're going to end up in Brazil. And airline officials, private security guards, and other non-state agents literally won't let them board the plane. So they just prevent cross-border movement. They have the discretion to deny anybody boarding. They don't need to provide a reason. And so that is something that we see a lot. And this is also an issue for trans folks who maybe don't have an appearance that necessarily matches what their gender is on their passport, or any other things that might potentially flag them as someone who hasn't traveled much previously. That can be a grounds for refusing to even let them board. And then there are also these things called carrier sanctions, where governments will impose steep fines or even suspend airline licenses if that state ends up deporting someone that the airline let in. So if somebody gets in, they claim asylum, they're deemed inadmissible, that airline could be liable for that. So it's a real incentive actually for airlines not to take that risk and to be looking out for people and to be rejecting them. So it's almost like airlines and these private actors are really policing, acting as a policing mechanism for queers who are trying to potentially access safety. As I mentioned, another major barrier that we face in our work and that our people are facing, our queer folks that we're supporting, is problems in transit countries. So as I mentioned, oftentimes transit countries are less safe for people who are fleeing because in addition to being in a persecutory environment, they may be stuck in a camp, they may not have access to a work permit, they might be experiencing all kinds of persecution and they still can't get any kind of state protection. And so really being able to provide people support, the right kind of support when they are in transit, which could be a couple months to a couple of years. What kind of support is that? How do we not only provide material support, but again, mental health support while they are in this very difficult situation? And then, of course, post-settlement, not everything is rosy. So getting to a country, even if you get to a country, let's say you're living the dream and you get to Canada, which I would not say is necessarily living the dream, but let's just say what people maybe potentially think about Canada. So you come here, you go to Europe, whatever, you make an asylum claim, you get through, your claim's accepted. Now what? Well, there are a lot of post-settlement challenges that migrants are facing in all kinds of countries. So that is something that we're also helping people with, and we're trying to strategize around how to support people. So that's like financial assistance in just breaking isolation, in language, in settlement services, all of that kind of thing. And then like processing their experiences, adjusting to a new country, all of that is really, really challenging. To address these harms, the Rainbow Railroad is working both within and outside these international protection systems. We're trying to leverage creative solutions, which again, build on the resiliency and courage of our case individuals. So we try to work closely, as I said, with the host community and asylum seeker networks to provide support. We create maps of LGBTQ inclusive services in different jurisdictions so that we can provide those resources to other people. And we try to, figure out how to respond to urgent protection needs, including food, medicine, safe shelter, while people are dealing with all of this in between. And at the same time, we're advocating with governments to find durable pathways and durable solutions for people who are in these situations and most in need of protection. Okay, and just as this last slide, just thinking through how people can support. So when I'm thinking about this, like we are fundamentally an activist organization. A lot of the people who work here are activists. I myself am definitely an activist and an abolitionist, border abolitionist, prison abolitionist. So definitely supporting your battles at home, taking nothing for granted. I think everybody knows about the challenges that we're facing in our own backyards. In Saskatchewan, there's all kinds of stuff going on, every province, every state. So getting involved in those battles and really not taking anything for granted. As Laura was mentioning, things can change kind of like this unless we fight back. So supporting each other, believing in our collective power. If you are interested in ever exploring what it would be like to privately sponsor a refugee, that's something you can definitely look into. You can come together with a group of Canadian citizens or permanent residents and potentially sponsor an LGBTQ refugee to come to Canada who needs support. Obviously, come check us out. You can donate to Rainbow Railroad or volunteer when we have events. And spread the word, speak out, not just about queer liberation, but also migrant justice. Like these are really, really connected struggles. And I think it's so important. And I've seen it time and time again that people are really, really isolated in the places that there are. And so knowing that there is support internationally really does make a difference and allows people to kind of keep going in their day-to-day fight, which promises to be a long one. Yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you, Swati. So I don't know if I should say we have one question for all of you, or I don't know if I see that there is also a question in the chat. I don't know if students here or other people might have a question for you.
Can you bring up the presenters on the
screen? So that we can see all of them. I don't know. Do you think we can start with at least one question? We have a question for all of you, and then if you have questions, that would be great to hear voices.
Thank you so much, Swati, Victor, and Laura. What a treat to hear such a wide range of histories, presence, and some of the really important things that are going on and need to be going on in our futures. My question, and Swati, I think I know what your answer is going to be to this question, to the first part of this question, but my question is to all three of you. What do you see as the key issues facing gender and sexually diverse communities today, whether from a transnational or local perspective, and do you see a benefit to coalition building around such issues?
Wants to go first? I don't know if Victor, Laura, Swati wants to try and answer.
Well, I'll take a swat at it. I think that the rise of illiberalism globally is the biggest threat, and that encompasses multiple marginalized communities and a real erosion in the belief in collective security. I'm looking at Congress's failure to enact the renewed aid for Ukraine. Democratic institutions are under duress all over the world, and that is undoubtedly going to inform collective notions of security. And I think that the peril that inheres in that encompasses anybody whose human rights could be determined by whether or not these bodies are going to rise up to defend them. And if NGOs can do a lot on their own, but they also operate in a whole constellation of international law and international councils and organizations, and if those are faltering, the ability to do their work is compromised.
Thank you, Laura. Victor or Swati?
Swati, would you like to answer first? No? Okay. So I will talk about the Mexican case, which I'm most familiar with. And there are really two issues when it comes to transnational queer organizing. The first issue is the biggest issue in Mexico. There is a massive destabilization and weakening of institutions. And this is because North Americans consume too many drugs. A report just provided yesterday in the Mexican Congress says the Mexican drug economy is now employing 175,000 people in Mexico. But we are at a point where it's more employees than any other corporation in Mexico. But it is also at a point where rival drug gangs are launching fleets of, what are those little helicopters called? That to deliver bombs into drones. Drones to destabilize the situation, to panic the population, to create more migration, to free up valuable land, to produce more drugs, so that someone in Wisconsin, Saskatchewan, or some other place can enjoy the drug. We need to tackle that. That's really destabilizing Mexico, and it's not getting any better. The current regime in Mexico, I think, they like to call themselves the fourth transformation. President López Obrador has really weakened the institutional resources available to research institutions. They have really compromised academic freedom in Mexico. If your institution is criticizing the state, you will find that all of a sudden the support for graduate programs has been pulled. A lot of folks that have been very vocal in criticizing the state in Mexico have had to apply for jobs and look elsewhere. I was involved in helping one person who is not gay, queer, or anything, but is an ally. Most notably, the best historian of conservatism in Mexico, also the most outspoken and pro-gay historian of Mexico, is now safely in a Texan institution. There were some threats made against him. So those are some of the issues that I see occurring in Mexico. And one third thing that I thought of currently, I'm involved in some public history programs, and we've been able to save a significant amount of resources, private collections, ephemera, publications. But there's a problem of, where do we hide it? Where do we stash it? There are no subsidies for archives to the level that people had enjoyed before. So, and also, how do we get these folks to talk to each other? There are 31 states in the Mexican Federation, but we don't have an index of all these community organization groups. So we need to help facilitate more conversation. And in some places, there are fights to the death between factions. A big division in Mexico is division between feminists who are accused of being transphobic, and the rest of the community. So that is a massive setback. How do we get folks to the table? So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And Swati, how would you?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be brief. What is the biggest challenge? I truly don't know. There's so many, and the issues are all really interconnected, as both Victor and Laura were highlighting. And I think they're so different in each jurisdiction, like each place that there is. So when I'm thinking about the African region, for example, and what we're seeing in a lot of that continent, I mean, it's so much about deeply entrenched values that are also so intertwined with religion. And so there's so much education and unlearning that needs to do, and so many people who actually just need exposure to queer people to, kind of try and destigmatize all of that. It's very difficult for me to even conceptualize how you begin deconstructing some of these very deeply held mentalities around things. But I think one of the major challenges, again, as we were talking about these institutions that have so much control over our lives, that people, when these institutions are unstable, people are in such a difficult and precarious situation. So like, I definitely agree that we need coalitions, we need partnerships, we need community organizations connecting with each other. That is actually what we need, these networks of support. But people are just so focused on survival. And I don't think this is just limited to the queer liberation movement. I think it's about so many other liberation movements as well, is that we're always positioned in this reactionary mode. And we're always just kind of trying to survive, like make it to the next day, so much that we're so exhausted to even do that other larger systemic and coalition building work. And so I think, trying to find a way to ensure that people are able to survive and be safe in their own community so that they can be positioned to do some of that unlearning and deconstructing work is really what we need. But it's a tall order. And yeah.
Victor, do you want to add something? And also,
Yeah, I wanted to add something.
One second, Victor. If anybody has a question, I would really invite you to ask one. But Victor, go ahead.
Just very briefly, I wanted to share also one thing that's very frustrating in trying to help Mexican community LGBTQ archives and organizations is one of the ways that I try to help is by inviting the leaders of these organizations to come present at international conferences or to, and a very big problem with the United States Department of State, and particularly with consular services, is because of COVID, people's visa appointments are taking 2 and 3 years to be processed, and it's a very difficult process. Once upon a time, in the beautiful golden years of the Cold War, I, as a professor, as an administrator, could call my congressional delegation and put pressure to make sure that permission was granted to a scholar that we were inviting and paying to come to the country. And I can't do that anymore. It's very challenging to organize international groups when you cannot get these folks in the door. And then never mind the length of the interview, of the appointment. The problems that come up when you're working with a person that's organizing people in a slum. They don't have bank accounts. They don't have any of those things that we created 70 years ago to watch our borders, and that do not understand the processes underway. How can I bring in someone that can't prove they have an income? How can I bring in someone that I can't prove that they have enough property to go back to? That is a very frustrating part of trying to facilitate this kind of work.
Thank you, Victor. Do we have any? Okay, we have one question. I don't know, maybe you can use that. Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've heard all of you folks kind of touch on how hard it is and everything wrong. So I guess my question, and it's more about community focused or people doing frontline, how are you sustaining? You talk about survival, you talk about, it would be great to have coalitions, community organization, et cetera, but I can see 3 people now who are doing a lot of work, and I don't know how you're sustaining yourselves, because I imagine that I don't think it gets better. We can hope, but there's always going to be the struggle of keeping up with which country needs, more support right now. So yeah.
To go for the question.
Yeah, you can't take anybody's rights for granted. And, as a historian, you could put these things in a long relief, and it's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back for any justice related movement. Now, I had many years that I was also an advocate and an academic. I founded the statewide LGBT advocacy organization in Oklahoma, and it was like 2 full-time jobs to be a professor and do that. And that just wasn't sustainable. And that's why I think it's really important that we tell stories like this to inspire other people to get involved in the struggle, because it is exhausting and can be very dispiriting, and you need that new energy and you need those new ideas, and you do have to take inspiration from the victories and the extraordinary courage of people. In the biggest surprise of my book was, I thought this was going to be a post 1970s story. Well, it actually starts in the late 18th century, when France becomes the first country in the world to decriminalize same-sex relations. You mentioned the intersections of colonialism in this. Well, that is absolutely right. Countries that were colonized by the French do not have the same vestiges of these sodomy laws than those that were colonized by the British. So very long history here. And we need people's energy and willingness to do this work, and to bring new people in, because it can be really exhausting. And it is important to take care of yourself while you do it.
Can I just ask one question as well? How can we do all the work that you're doing, that you're suggesting, without being colonizers again? Because in the end, I mean, it's like, even Swati, like, how can we help without being the colonizers again? I mean, without imposing, maybe certain point of view, certain way of thinking about identity. So it's very complicated. It's not easy at all. So how can we do it?
I mean, I think fundamentally we have to be led by, as I said, led by the people who are in that context, who have been struggling within that context, who have been, trying to be part of the movement. And so there are things, for example, that like as an organization that, there might be things operationally on the ground that, wouldn't be an approach that we would take. Maybe that's not actually how the words that we would even use, or the framing that we would use to, let's say, educate, or to create some training, or to pass the message on about what's going on. But we are giving that autonomy to other people who are the experts in being able to support their own communities and to speak the language and to understand the cultural expectations and the cultural norms, so that it's really their own ideas, right? And I think it's important to, it's interesting because we talk about how actually these same-sex laws were a product of colonialism, whereas a lot of the discourse in colonized countries is that gayness is a Western import, right? So at the same time, it's kind of that argument. In fact, the West are the ones that, put in place these laws in the first place to criminalize, and then they're also being held sort of responsible for propagating gayness or promoting gayness or whatever it is. So, I mean, I think in short, we have to be super, super conscious of what you're saying, Alessio, and I think not just in this context, but in any kind of nonprofit context, to avoid being part of the nonprofit industrial complex, which is just sort of neoliberal charity models, which are replicating colonial systems in many ways. I think it is about, as much as possible, putting our resources towards building capacity on the ground for the folks to then be uplifted and meet their own needs, and then also have the capacity to move beyond that. But I think that's a really real tension that we have to always be super alive to.
I think part of the issue, thinking as a historian, and I don't want to go down this too far, the elites that built the nation states in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and it's more complicated, knew their colonizers so well that they internalized their ideas, and it's taking them a long time to change. In Muslim world, it's a little more complicated. The West benefited. We went through Reformation, and we went through Enlightenment. We're dealing with cultures whose internal social notions are not on the same time scale as ours, and you can't force cultures to change that quickly. right? So we just need to be more patient and find workarounds. I think the kind of work that we do when we try to train and we try to provide resources and we try to facilitate communication to create, if you will, woke groups within these societies that know how to work within their societies, that know how to use what support we provide them to be effective in their societies, I think there are better results. When I have problems with the U.S., I also remember, well, there's the Spanish embassy and there's the Dutch embassy and there's the German embassies, and I direct my folks to go to those conferences so that they can network with those European countries and get those European resources. An amazingly small country, but a very effective country in leading and funding LGBT efforts in Latin America are the Dutch. Who would have thought, right? So it's just I can't even start counting the number of conferences and publications that the Dutch have facilitated in Latin America in the 90s and the early 2000s. That we as a superpower lagged so far behind is a shame. But to see the wonderful things that were done by the Dutch is just wonderful and, you know, worthy of emulation. So what I try to do is, you know, I try to operate transnationally. I know what are the problems, I know what are the limitations with U.S. funding and bringing folks to the U.S. So I say, all right, let's call the Spanish embassy, let's call the Dutch embassy, let's see what we can do.
Victor, I mean, given that we are, I think, over time, but I don't know if Laura just wants to say something briefly about my questions and then we can close. I don't want to cut you out.
No, I think I've said my piece.
Okay, great. Thank you. So thank you, everybody, for being here. I want to thank once again our speakers, Laura, Swati, and Victor. Thank you so much for your very inspiring talks. And I really do hope that, you know, many students here had a chance to learn from you and be inspired by you. So thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Ciao.